The Battle for Their Land, Native Americans and the Indian Removal Act by Finley Palmquist, Roberto Buendia, and Jacob Espinoza. The Native Americans were the first ones on this land. They welcomed the Europeans as if they were one of their own, and as a way of repercussion, the United States removed them from their own land, forcing them to abandon all that they'd become accustomed to and walk, starving and dehydrated, for hundreds of miles through the forest full of biting, stinging creatures. Some even had young babies and children to look after while on the trail. All of this was supposedly caused by the United States' fear of England and Spain taking over more land in North America. However, in reality, white settlers wanted more land that was richer in fertility and resources, of which the U.S. was going to use to grow crops, such as cotton. This land just so happened to be in the Native Americans' possession. This in turn caused psychological damage that has been passed down from generation to generation, and more importantly, the highest suicide rate of any ethnicity in the U.S. today. In 1650, England became the first country to set up major colonies in North America and became the first people from another country to maintain contact with the Native Americans. However, relations weren't the best between the English and the Native Americans because the English were known for forcing the Native Americans out of their villages and making them work as slaves. Worse, the British would massacre their villages, killing their buffalo and their people. These people were their family, their friends. And those buffalo, they used those buffalo from everything to clothes to hunting resources. This was the first of the atrocities that the Native Americans would have to come to face. Things went on like this until the Revolutionary War in 1775, which allowed the Native Americans to be rid of Britain's tyranny. To their surprise, the Americans continued right where the British left off and murdered and alienated the Native Americans to every extent, such as the Indian Creek Massacre of 1830, who were later ransomed. The savage treatment of Native Americans continued for many years after the British left.
By the 1830s, an estimated 125,000 Native Americans lived in areas covering what is now Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, land occupied and cultivated by their ancestors for generations. Within a decade, all that changed as Native Americans were pushed off their land when white settlers began moving in. Believing they were more important than all others, these settlers embraced the idea of manifest destiny, or the belief that the United States' westward expansion was inevitable. They set out to conquer the entire continent. They did all of this under the guise of it being God's plan. They advocated that it was okay to take someone else's land because it would open up trade routes, strengthen the national security, and spread democracy and liberty to others. Settlers saw no value in the land beyond what it provided to their own self-interest. The rationalization for displacing entire tribes of Native Americans was more than white settlers' sense of entitlement. The roots of justification extended into the belief that Native Americans were no more than uncivilized savages who had no legitimate rights to the land. This was not a new idea. For years, the United States had attempted to move native tribes off their own land by claiming it was better for their happiness and enjoyment because, as a dying race, they did not need all that land. This narrative was furthered when President Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 through Congress and signed it into law in May 1830. This allowed the president to give land west of the Mississippi to the tribes who agreed to peacefully give up their own land within the current state borders. This caused a conflict for the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole Indians, or the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called, whose land the U.S. wanted, as they had no desire to leave their ancestral homes for the unknown. Being given an ultimatum, leave peacefully or by force, was a one-sided compromise, benefiting only the United States. The Native Americans were left with an internal conflict. In order to spare their lives, they had to leave enormous parts of who they were, their culture, tradition, and identity. This was no small sacrifice. As one Cherokee Legislative Council member explained, "Inclination to remove from this land has no abiding place in our hearts, and when we move, we shall move by the course of nature to sleep under this ground which now covers them in their undisturbed peace." The council member expressed what was in the hearts of all Native Americans. The land was more than their home. Its value resided in their very essence of who they were, where they had come from, and where they would remain. They were desperate to hold onto it, and by extension, their very heritage. Despondent and demoralized, the 5 civilized tribes looked to the U.S. to operate in good faith in reselling the nations. The U.S., in turn, betrayed that faith by not having a thought-out solution, which led to the Native Americans being herded into temporary camps. Some were operated as concentration camps in the sense that tribes were deported and dumped into wastelands that they had no connection to, that had few natural resources, and that were allocated no government funding for. Others functioned as prisons or death camps, guarded by gun towers and weaponry. The The Cherokee experienced such camps. After being arrested and dragged from their homes and loaded into wagons like livestock, they endured acts of intimidation and cruelty by the U.S. troops, who provided no waste facilities and fed the inhabitants little food. The Seminoles found their ways to camps over the course of 20 years. Their removal was brutal, as people young and old were hunted, collected, and placed along ships, along with runaway African slaves the Seminoles had protected and sheltered. These indignities were only a few on a long list that made it clear to the 5 civilized tribes that they as a people were unimportant and expendable to the government. When the Cherokee tried to lease parts of their land to the large cattle ranchers for grazing, the U.S. blocked their effort and offered instead to purchase the land for a fraction of its worth. The Cherokee rejected the deal and protested. President Harrison then banned grazing on those lands, pressuring the Cherokee into compromising. The tribes sold their land to the government. After stripping them of their lands, the U.S. worked methodically to dismantle Native Americans of their cultural identity. In 1834, the government created manual labor camps and boarding schools as a way to convert and indoctrinate Native American children to Christianity and erase all identifiers of their culture by giving them English names, teaching them labor and mechanical arts, and forbidding them from speaking their own language. Those children were used as hostages to prevent potential conflicts between the tribes and the U.S. These boarding schools continued to operate well into the 1970s.
The subjugation of Native Americans by the U.S. incurred insurmountable costs for them as a nation. Once proud and resilient, these uprooted tribes were left broken by hardship and instability. Their future uncertain as they struggled to recover from the lost connection to their culture and identity. Their wounds would have been allowed to fester in present day. Today's Native Americans are a husk of the people they were once because of the historic trauma their people endured since the signing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. While the U.S. reports a 12.8 poverty rate across the country, more than 50% of Native Americans are suffering through these conditions. This is due large to the fact that unemployment rates on the reservations soared 20 times higher than the general population at 70%. Furthermore, 25% of Native American children live in poverty, and the graduation rate for reservation students is 17% lower than the national average. The acclaimed sociologist Emil Durkheim theorized there were 4 types of suicide, which was either caused by integration into or regulation of society, and Native American suicides can be categorized as egoistic or fatalistic. Native Americans commit egoistic suicide because they were made to feel inhuman and stripped of their identities, as if being separated from their land that had so much meaning. On the other hand, they also commit fatalistic suicide because of the boarding schools over-regulating their lives and being forced into becoming something they are not. Young Native Americans and children on the reservation are exposed to high rates of domestic violence, alcoholism and drug addiction, sexual assault, and are twice as likely to be victims of abuse or neglect. They have higher exposure to rates of trauma and have PTSD rates comparable to veterans returning from Afghanistan. This toxic accumulation of historical factors contributes to the sense of loss and overpowering hopelessness Native youth feel every day, and is what has pushed them to holding the highest suicide rate in the nation, with a rate of 22.5 suicides per 100,000 people versus 12.8 for the rest of the U.S. Native reservation youth accounts for more than 40% of the suicides committed each year. Officials from a U.S. Justice Department task force reported that the levels of suicide was startling, considered the epidemic another outcome of pervasive despair among Native American youth. These staggering figures illustrate the trail of devastation generations have felt from U.S. treaties that work to erode Native Americans' identity, livelihood, and opportunity. Historically, suicide among youth was unheard of among Native tribes, as communal child rearing practices and beliefs within the culture provided a built-in safety net. This all changed when the U.S. government pushed to assimilate Native tribes by forcibly removing their children from their families and placing them in boarding schools, where the Native American community had no control. The children experienced systematic violence and abuse. These practices of inequality and discrimination have been carried into current U.S. policies, where reservations are underfunded, especially in healthcare. U.S. government spends an average of $8,000 per general population. A federal prisoner has more money given by the government for healthcare than an urban Native American. Sarah Kastelic, the director of National Indian Child Welfare Association, said historical trauma is a phrase used most often by experts looking at the suicide rates on reservations. The United States' involvement with and historical treatment of Native Americans cannot be filtered out of Native American youth suicide rate discussion. U.S. treaties and deals meant as guaranteed compromises to end conflicts between the tribes and the government never happened, and has left those on reservations lost and forgotten.